Good afternoon. This is Frank Malatesta, and I wanted to talk today a little bit about the changes that are going to be affecting employees and employers with the changing from the Obama administration in White House to the Trump administration in White House. We've seen 8 years of a Democratic president assigning Democratic judges with a Democrat in the wage and hour division, in the labor secretary in charge of selecting who will be enforcing what when it comes to employee and employer violations of the Fair Labor Standards Act, as well as other federal laws that protect employees. And I think it's important to kind of review exactly what changes have been put in place, where there's been expansions, what's been happening with the National Labor Relations Board, and what we expect to happen kind of in response to that. So we had two very significant regulatory changes over in the Department of Labor in the past 8 years. And that was affecting home care workers, workers who take care of the elderly. Now they are no longer exempt from overtime and minimum wage, meaning that these individuals will be entitled to time and a half after 40 hours. And it's made it a lot more stringent on how people could be taken care of. Instead of maybe having somebody as a live-in caregiver where they're literally working 24/7 and sleeping, maybe not, depending on the severity of the case of the illness, you've got workers who are now cycling in and out, but they're getting time and a half if they need to be in there more often than 40 hours. So it's very important that we talk a little bit about this because employees are going to feel the change, as will employers. For better or worse, the Obama administration has been very hands-on in how they influence the workplace, how responsive they are. I remember just last, I think, August or July, I sat down at a local CLE where people from the Department of Labor were speaking on what their practices are and what they do when they're issued a complaint. They said that less than, I think, 10% of what they investigate is based upon complaints. 90% of what the Department of Labor investigates is based upon what they decide to investigate. So if they want to protect a specific demographic or they want to go after somebody specifically, they're going to go do that. They also do the complaint stuff, but the priority is aggressive, going after people who don't necessarily make complaints. And I think a lot of that has to do with maybe a focus on immigrant workers who may not be on the books, who are hidden in there and aren't getting recognition for what their rights are, breaks, compensation, etc., and what that looks like. So I think it's important for employees and employers to realize that it's a whole new ballgame, because no longer are you probably going to have the Department of Labor spending 90% of its time generating work for itself. Instead, you'll probably have them focusing on people or employees who raise issues with employers. So I think that's going to be a very different ballgame. And here in Florida, where the Tallahassee legislature has some employment issues or laws that they put in place, but most of it's coming directly from the federal government. So the feds are going to decide, and the Trump administration is going to decide exactly how that plays out. And it's still waiting to be seen, but I think clearly we might see a little bit of a pulling back. Now, I remember we were in that CLE over the summer, and the Department of Labor investigator, she was talking about how they're now utilizing other agencies to enforce the labor standards. So if you're, let's say, a healthcare provider, a nursing home, and you decide to utilize independent contractors to bring in and supplement your workforce because census goes up and down, right? And you don't want to have to pay unemployment. You don't want to pay benefits for somebody who, once you go below 75% census, you're going to need to lay off. So you bring in those outside contractors. Now the Department of Labor comes in. Nobody even needs to call them. They just might decide to start, for lack of a better term, raiding nursing homes. So they could go in there And what they're going to do is they're going to call the local Department of Health. They're going to tell them that you're violating your employees' rights. And there's no due process in this. They're going to call up AHCA, the Agency of Healthcare Administration, and they're going to tell them that they're violating your employees' rights. So you're going to get pressure from these other government agencies that they have drafted up these lateral agreements with, so that whenever they find an issue, everybody from the government will come down and bring it to bear. So this is kind of a scary thought of what employers have been dealing with. Now, for employees, a lot of times they don't care. I'll be honest with you. As long as they're getting their hours and they're making the amount of money they're happy with, they're typically not going to start ruffling feathers. It's really the squeaky wheels when the relationship ends that tend to be bringing a lot of these issues and identifying things. I know, for example, places where you get tips, for example. These individuals are making tons of money, but somebody gets angry, and then they go in there and it gets frustrated, and the whole system gets redone so that it's to the letter of the law. So I think what we're going to find is a very different scenario over the next 4 years, 8 years, if Trump manages to stay in office, and how that's going to affect things. Now, we also need to remember that Trump did receive significant support from private unions. So in the private sector, unions as a part of manufacturing, etc., he saw a lot of broad support. So it'd be interesting to see what his take on employment area specifically is. Now, he did put in charge of the Department of Labor a fast food restaurant chain, big suit guy. I don't know exactly who he is, but essentially he's big business for employers that hire people. They want them cheap, they want them replaceable, they want them interchangeable. So that is a very different idea than his manufacturing jobs. So he's got somebody not from manufacturing in Department of Labor, but for somebody from kind of the consumer industry, where labor needs to be cheap, needs to shut up, and needs to get out of the way. So we've got two very different kind of worlds, and we'll see how he treats the National Labor Relations Board, as well as how the Department of Labor moves forward. Right now, we've got some hesitancy because down in Texas, a district court judge did put a stay on the increase in the minimum salary level. Now, we didn't get into the salary increase for exempt employees, and we're going to do that probably in the next part of the series, but I just want to reference that if the Department of Labor loses the Circuit Court of Appeals, it's up to Trump to decide whether or not he wants to even continue. So as it is right now, that regulation that increases exempt employees' wage, I believe, is declared unconstitutional. So it's not the law. Just like what happened when I believe a Democratic mayor went into New York City and stop and frisk was being challenged and it was going through the judicial process. If the government, under the direction of President Trump or his labor secretary, decide to not challenge the lack of constitutionality of that provision, just like they did with stop and frisk, then it'll remain unconstitutional. So just be aware that is a major change that everyone was preparing for, which may not even come to fruition anymore. So just be on the lookout. We're going to have more kind of discussions in this series, and I just want to keep going as we learn more about Trump, maybe talk a little bit more specificity about how the regulation changed with the exemption, talk a little bit more about how the Department of Labor versus how the Bush administration, with the issuance of labor opinions as opposed to these massive documents on joint employment and fracturing of ownership of the employee. So we've got just this really dynamically opposed beliefs, whereas the Obama administration believed that everybody was an employee and independent contractors did not exist. It was a fantasy made up essentially by employers to take advantage of their employees, not paying benefits, not paying taxes, not paying health insurance, not paying maternity leave, not paying family leave, not paying basically not paying for the value of the benefits that they receive from that employee. Now we have an administration where we really don't understand or know how he's going to proceed with these types of issues. Right now, the economics realities test is something that's put in place under the case law, but the Department of Labor really controls how aggressively and how that's going to be interpreted. Just like when we look at the IRS has a completely different standard. So it's really up to our federal government to dictate how that exempt status is determined, how that independent contractor status is determined, what benefits you're afforded as an employee. So look out for a little more discussion on that. We're going to take a look at what Bush looked like. We're going to take a look at what Obama looked like for each of these different issues I've kind of touched upon. So you guys have a great day, and I look forward to you checking back with the next part of the series. Thank you.